insulin to begin with. Tell people what insulin does and then what insulin resistance does.
Yeah, brilliant. Insulin is an absolutely essential hormone in the body. As much as I am going to go on in the next few minutes and paint the picture of it being a villain, it's critical. If you don't have it, you have a disease called type 1 diabetes and you will die. Type 1 diabetes used to be a death sentence. In the absence of insulin, the body will not last long. And so it is here for a purpose. We need it. However, we need it to work in our favor. And to do that, we need it to be generally keeping in a normal range. And so you just a moment ago framed the question by pointing a finger at carbohydrates. I agree with that completely. That's a whole topic. As much as over the past decades we vilified dietary fat, oh boy, we got it wrong. And wouldn't you know it, in the first time in history, as far as I know, a government issues a mandate telling its people what to eat, and boy, they got it wrong. No surprise, right? That has happened so often when you take things to that level. So if we put the blame where it belongs, not only are carbohydrates the only macronutrient that people have an addiction for, no one's addicted to fat, no one's addicted to protein. If only people were sitting around on a Friday night listening to us chat and thinking, oh, I really want a stick of butter. No one. They want something sweet and gooey. They want something salty and crunchy. So we crave carbs, and they have myriad metabolic effects, one of which is to spike insulin. So this is answering the question of what does insulin do? Insulin's most famous effect, but not its only effect, and I would even say not its most important effect. Its most famous effect is to look at that rise in blood sugar or blood glucose and say, that's beyond homeostasis. This isn't right. If that stays high for long, it's going to start harming the body, because hyperglycemia alone is pathogenic. And so insulin acts as a hero and says, your problem, I'm going to take care of you. It brings the temperature back down like a thermostat, the perfect example of homeostasis, brings the glucose back down to normal. And then insulin, having done its job, retreats back into the background, if you will.
But what's its chemical role in relationship to the conversion of carbohydrate to energy?
Oh, yeah, right. That's a great question.
Yep.
So glucose, you mentioned a moment ago, and as you did so, I sort of couldn't help but think of the kind of a metaphor of like engines, where glucose, the body has two primary fuels. At any moment, it's either sugar burning, blood glucose, or fat burning. One is like a kind of race car engine. Boy, it's going to be really quick, and you don't have a lot of fuel, and you're going to get terrible gas mileage, but boy, it's going to be a quick ride. The other is like a big diesel engine, rumbling down the roads of Alberta, going across the Trans-Canada Highway and taking its load. It's going to go forever. It's never going to run out of fuel.
That's the fat metabolism.
That's fat metabolism. Yeah. And now the next question is, well, who decides? Insulin decides. Insulin, once again, when it comes to any metabolic effect, you need never go further than insulin. There are other hormones that want to pretend that they matter. Thyroid kind of matters. Cortisol kind of matters. Insulin rules them all. And insulin, if it's up, it dictates it's time for sugar burning. If insulin's down, then the body says, all right, it's time for fat burning. In fact, that's where the whole ketogenic aspect comes from. When insulin's down, it is so incompatible with the body storing energy that it literally begins burning more fat than it knows what to do with. It's met its energy needs already, but it can't stop burning fat, and so it starts burning more than it needs, and that more, if you will, becomes ketones. It's sort of a metabolic release valve, like a pressure release valve, of a way of saying, I'm burning more than I need, and so I've gone beyond what the cell requires, so ketones are going to become a good alternative. But then back to, or transition.
Would you think that the, like historically, again, over an evolutionary time span, easily digestible high sugar carbs would have been essentially non-existent, right?
Imagine what we would have had to do to get them. We either had to prepare for battle against a hive of bees.
Right.
And
when we could find them.
Yes, when we could find them, or further, when we could find a digestible carbohydrate, maybe berries or something, because people need
tubers.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
We have to appreciate that what we eat is either going to defend itself by claw or by chemical. And a plant doesn't have the advantage of running away or attacking back. So if we dropped any number of us in the wilderness, good luck.
Yeah. Well,
even if you're surrounded by plants.
We have to understand too that, like, we might think that historically human beings existed on the kind of vegetables that we have now, or fruits. But all those vegetables and fruits have been genetically altered to a degree that's just beyond comprehension. I mean, if you look at the origin plant of corn, I mean, it doesn't look anything like, it looks nothing like
even
corn.
look at an apple, like
right.
Look at an apple 100 years ago. It was these teeny little crab apples,
sour things.
Now they're these big juicy sugar bombs.
Yeah, exactly.
But the more we eat these sugar bombs and they're like, the more glucose is going up, the more insulin has to come up, and now we've come to what I believe is in fact the main driver of insulin resistance as I transition to insulin resistance, which is too much insulin. And people may hear that and think, well, hold on, you're talking about insulin resistance. Too much insulin is the main cause of insulin resistance. And lest it seem a little unexpected, it is a fundamental biological principle. Too much of something will cause a resistance to that something.
Right.
Whether it's body or soul, if we are exposed to a stimulus over time, that noxious stimulus, it becomes noxious, and we try to adapt.
Well, dose matters, right? There's lots of things that are healthy in proportionate dose. So now we're eating carbs continually,
all the time.
So we're relying on this fast energy source. One consequence of that is storage in fat.
Yes.
One consequence of that is if there's too much storage in fat, is that triggers its own form of insulin resistance. But you also alluded to an insulin resistance, I believe, that's merely a consequence of insulin that spikes too high.
That's right.
So there's multiple reasons for insulin resistance in a heavy carb-loaded diet.
Oh, yes. All of them become relevant there. Yes, so we've now kind of gone to both here. The slow insulin resistance is the slow and steady growth of the fat cell, which we outlined earlier, and that's a consequence of insulin being up, telling the fat cell to grow, and the fat cell saying, okay, insulin, what do you want me to grow with? It's the calories. So you have to have both for a fat cell to grow, an insulin stimulus and sufficient calories to fuel the growth. Then we have the fast insulin resistance. I mentioned inflammation, that is one. And then the other one, that is the main one, I argue, is too much insulin itself. And then once the body becomes insulin resistant, now you really can start going down that list of chronic diseases that are the top 10 killers. And to a one, you can see how insulin resistance is either the main contributor or one of the main contributors, like
to all of
them. Like type 2 diabetes is entirely a disease of insulin resistance, where over time, if you have two variables, the insulin and the glucose, one of the great tragedies from a metabolic scientist with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, is that we have a glucose-centric paradigm. Just to use this as an example of how insulin resistance contributes to disease, the conventionally trained clinician only looks at the glucose. They may not have even ever measured the insulin. And when I give these kinds of talks to physicians, they can't even wrap their head around insulin being a marker that matters. And yet the irony is it's the one that matters most, because over the life of the person with type 2 diabetes, their insulin has been going higher and higher and higher. But the glucose is staying normal.
Blood glucose.
And so when they come in for their annual checkup, the physician just says, well, glucose is normal, so you're good. But you have high blood pressure. Well, guess what the leading cause of high blood pressure is? Insulin resistance. Or they may say, you have fatty liver disease.
Right.
Guess what the leading cause of fatty liver disease is? You have early signs of cognitive decline or dementia.
Right.
None of
Diabetes
those are glucose.
type 3.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes. Where now the brain's becoming insulin resistant. And if we could shift the paradigm to an insulin-centric paradigm, that they would have detected, and then it's 20 years later where they finally see, oh, your glucose is high. Well, now
but it's worse than that, I think, if I remember correctly, because so you said that one of the ways that physicians are marking whether you're healthy is to look at your blood glucose levels, but they age correct those so that the norms for you at 50, what would be normal at 50 is diabetic at 20, but that makes no sense, because if your blood sugar levels are as high at 50 as they would have been in 20 if you would have been diagnosed diabetic, it's just as bad for you at 50.
Oh, in fact, it's
an insane correction.
Insane. In fact, it's even more pernicious. If you look over time at what the diabetic cutoff used to be, over the past 70 or so years since that became a marker,
So that's been
It's been
gerrymandered as well.
slowly coming down, and you would say, well, why bring it down? It's because the easier it is for people to stumble over, the easier it is to diagnose, and then the easier it is to say, I need to give you a drug. And that is what I believe is partly at the heart of the glucocentric paradigm. You can't drug